China's economy is in serious trouble, with economists around the world making grim predictions for its future. And it's not hard to see why. National and private debt is at an all-time high, a housing crash looks imminent, and investors and governments around the world are pulling out of China, causing open protest and dissent in one of the most authoritarian nations on the planet to break out in one of the most impactful ways since Tiananmen Square. This is why the CCP has been reluctant to reveal to the world just how awful things really are, with the Chinese government even delaying the release of key data on their economic performance. It appears that China is just like any other big swollen company on the verge of collapse, with many similar parallels to collapsing businesses. And if China doesn't do something soon, they're gonna face imminent disaster. But don't get me wrong, this won't just affect China, this will affect each and every one of us. And the solution to this problem looks extremely sinister. So what's happened in China to make things this bad? And why are governments around the world so worried about the solution to this problem? Well, the first reason that China's in so much trouble is because of their debt. Now, all countries have a lot of debt. At this point, it's an integral part of any modern economy, but in recent years, China has accrued a staggering amount of debt in such an incredibly short amount of time. To put this into perspective, from just 2020 to 2021 alone, China's debt grew by over $1.2 trillion. And let's not forget that this debt eventually needs to be paid off. And you see, this is the root problem of China's fatal debt spiral, because economists around the world are deeply worried about the debts that other countries owe China, as it's only when these are paid off that China will then finally be able to afford to start reducing its debt. Now, this might sound complicated, so we need to unpack some background knowledge. In 2013, China was an incredibly fast-growing economy, with almost everyone predicting it to outpace the US. Business was booming, and the government was looking for ways to both expand its influence and cement its regional power. They were looking to make subsidiaries and invest in them, hoping to reap the diplomatic and economic rewards later. But to become the world's largest economy, they had to be ambitious, or so they thought at the time, which is why China would embark on their Belt and Road Initiative. Xi Jinping, the incumbent Chinese de facto dictator, made it the cornerstone of his foreign policy. However, make no mistake, this dream of international dominance has been around ever since Mao. Mao Zedong, the first ruthless communist authoritarian Chinese dictator, created a 2049 plan that still stands strong as one of China's guiding principles. Mao envisioned a China that over the course of a century would grow to dominate its region and gain acceptance as a great power on the world stage. And by 2013, this had pretty much already happened. China had gone from a poverty-stricken hellhole to the second largest economy in the world. But China dreamt of more power. If they were going to overtake the US, they needed to engage in neo-colonialism by gaining a foothold in other countries as well as their own. The soft power that came from this would then help China unseat the US from its position at the top of the world, and this meant investing in developing nations. And so China went hard on this, pouring $838 billion into the scheme, loaning pretty much all of it to countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And in many ways this worked. China paid for hospitals, rail networks, roads, and even skyscrapers. And on the surface this seemed great, not only for helping these developing economies, but for helping the people in these countries. The amount of good that some of these investments have done for the poorest people cannot be understated. But again, this wasn't done as charity, this was to gain influence and power, and more importantly leverage over the world, with these poor governments becoming in debt to China. The thinking by China was, if they invested in all these poor countries that hate the West, these countries would soon become close allies of China, allowing China to gain vast dominance over the world, with all these poor countries being in debt to China and paying back through any means. However, this didn't exactly go to plan, which became very clear in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's new Lotus Tower stands 350 meters tall, looming over the cityscape as a blunt metaphor for Chinese investment. But what should have stood as a symbol of growth is instead seen as indicative of the reality of the situation. Financial Times reports that construction suffered from long delays, and there were corruption scandals surrounding the tower from day one. And once it was finished, its impact on Sri Lanka has been far outweighed by the debt it cost the country. In fact, parts of the building is still unused as of today, and the tower has completely failed to be at all profitable. The crushing debt that comes with investments like these were a defining factor in Sri Lanka's current economic chaos. In fact, Sri Lanka defaulted on their debt for the first time in the country's history, where they announced that they wouldn't be able to pay foreign creditors, with the IMF adding that Sri Lanka's current debt crisis is unsustainable and needs restructuring. And this problem is just a microcosm of China's grand strategy. With the economic turmoil the world is experiencing right now, more and more of these poor countries will default on their debts. And who do nearly all of these poor countries owe vast sums of money to? China. And there's just tons of examples of Chinese-funded projects that have gone nowhere. Pakistan was supposed to be a shining example in the Belt and Road Initiative. There were plans to build a new airport, a massive power plant, and even a water desalination plant. It was jointly predicted that these investments would create over 1 million jobs and put billions into Pakistan's economy in the long run, whilst also giving China a strong ally against Western India. But in reality, all of these projects haven't even been built yet, with both Pakistan and Sri Lanka either failing to or on the brink of failing to pay back their loans to China. And as you zoom out further, the problem just gets larger and larger. In a study of the 148 developing countries that China has invested in, 52 were placed in the highest risk group for economic stability. The bad debt from these countries have also required intervention on China's part. China had to renegotiate over $50 billion in bad debt over 2020 and 2021, meaning they had to defer it or forgive the debt entirely. And trust me when I say the problem goes even deeper. China's even had to offer out even more loans to support these fragile economies. And these emergency loans are yet another drain on China's stumbling economy, with tens of billions being spent on delaying the problem for just another day. And that day is finally catching up to China. The foreign debt problem is a product of the same mistake that companies make. With its massive growth, China thought that it could double down and expand its influence at a breakneck speed. But in doing so, China spread itself too thin. They overvalued their economy and invested too much into risky ventures. The CCP's founding focus on the 2049 plan has pushed their aspirations further than reality. It's become clear that they've bit off more than they could chew, which is why China is forced to downsize its influence in many other countries in order to keep itself afloat, a direct violation with their founding goals of global dominance as enshrined in the 2049 plan. And to pull out investments in other countries would be an embarrassing failure for the CCP, sending shockwaves throughout the nation, because the CCP's ability to project its power completely relies on its image, as any other good dictatorship does. And if people start believing that the CCP is weak, they'll lose faith in its propaganda and resent its control. And pulling back from the international stage would be seen as a weakness when considering the bold statements the CCP has made in the past. As we'll find out later, the cracks are already starting to show. But alternatively, if the CCP goes too far in its projection of international power, then it risks becoming an international pariah like Russia, which would of course do untold damage to China's economy, as is happening right now in Russia. The best course for the CCP is to continue pumping money into developing nations if they want to keep their international influence. But all of the problems with their economy might prevent them from doing so. But what are the other problems that are threatening China? I mean, if China's economy was still growing as fast as it was just a few years ago, these bad loans wouldn't be such a big issue. However, China's economic growth is starting to falter, and a large part of this economic slowdown in the country has to do with domestic projects in China itself. And this is the second reason that China's economy is going down the drain. But before we continue, I want to tell you about our video sponsor. If you've been watching my channel for a while now, you'll know how much tech giants and advertising companies stalk us, using all your data and information from social media to create profiles on you. Which is why I want to tell you about the video sponsor Malik VPN. Malik VPN is the only VPN focused on privacy and security. Using Malik and its global network of VPN servers, the data you transmit over the internet is kept private and secured, and you are protected against spyware. You can block data trackers that collect data for spyware, ads, crypto mining, and adult content sites. It also detects spyware in real time and checks if your device is being jailbroken or rooted. And you can also find Malik VPN on both iOS and Android. We also have some extra features, such as monitoring when and which apps secretly use the camera or microphone on your device, whilst also offering an anti-theft alarm for the physical security of the device, and you can mute your microphone to protect you from spies. Malik VPN is a paid app that gives you 2 days free of VPN usage to try out for yourself, which also includes some free features on Android. So check out Malik VPN today by clicking the link in the description below. You see, along with the bad debt that they're failing to collect, China's economy is also buckling under the weight of debt from their own projects. A great example of this is China's water problem. Now, within China, there's lots of water in the south, but not nearly enough water in the north. And so a grand solution has been in the minds of the CCP since it first came to power. And massive infrastructure projects have always been a significant part of the 2049 plan. Mao even hinted at this all the way back in 1952. There's plenty of water in the south, not much water in the north. If at all possible, borrowing some water would be good, end quote. And by the early 2000s, China began making this dream a reality, beginning the South-North Water Transfer Project. Boring name aside, the project is truly massive. It aims to divert 44.8 billion cubic meters of water from the Yangtze River to the north of the country. So far, it's only partially complete, despite being started 2 decades ago. it still remains one of the most expensive engineering projects in history. And that's the problem. The project is estimated to cost over $62 billion by the time it's finished. Lots of this has come from yet more borrowing, and the real amount could be far more than this. Of course, if it works as well as the Chinese authorities say it will, the project will only be a good thing for the people of China. But the question still remains, how is China going to pay for it? Sticking to the 2049 plan has gotten China to the second spot on the world stage, but it's also led them to the problems that they face today. Rigid adherence to the 2049 plan has been a blessing and curse, and yet China is still set to continue on course, no matter the cost, as evidenced by the sheer amount of infrastructure projects that China is investing in. Even despite their precarious economic situation, China's finance ministry has stated that it will be funding 102 mega projects just like the water project throughout 2021 to 2025. Examples include railway lines that will stretch across the country, tunnels that stretch for nearly 100 kilometers, and a whole swath of massive bridges. The CCP has even proposed a high-speed railway tunnel connecting Taiwan with the mainland. The idea was met with predictably icy reception in Taiwan itself. There's a reason China was creating this high-speed rail tunnel, a reason that will become clearer later on. But aside from this, all of these mega projects means China is taking on more and more debt. With the fragile state of their economy, the pressure of this may be too much for the country to take. It remains to be seen whether all of this investment in infrastructure will pay off, but if they turn out anything like China's foreign infrastructure investments, the outlook isn't good. However, all of this debt wouldn't be such a big problem if China's economy was still growing as fast as it was just 5 or 10 years ago, but it just isn't anymore. And this is the third problem that's facing China's economy. Their growth is slowing down. You see, since the 2008 financial crash, China's found it hard to reach the same levels of growth. From a staggering 15% of GDP growth in 2007, growth fell to under 10%, and in 2019, it had fallen further to only a 6% growth per year. So of course, China's economy is still growing, but not at a rate that justifies the huge amounts of CCP borrowing. With the slow loss of growth, it looks like China's economic golden age might have already passed. They're fast losing out to their competition as well. Developing nations like Bangladesh are already undercutting their production, offering lower prices that China just can't keep up with. As China's economic growth has created a huge middle class, a middle class that demands a satisfactory wage. But in places like Bangladesh, people will work for anything, becoming a huge thorn in China's side. But Bangladesh isn't the only one. Vietnam and Laos are also competing in manufacturing. India is a strong, nuclear-capable rival for China to contend with. The two countries are neighbors and have had continual border skirmishes.
20 Indian soldiers have fallen, killed in action, combating Chinese soldiers at the line of actual control.
Today, they're both engaged in another Cold War, both competing for geopolitical influence. China can't just worry about taking the #1 spot from the US, they also have to worry about the rising powers that surround them, with lots of them being openly hostile to China's interests, and as they lose their monopolistic control on global production, it's not surprising to see their economy slowing down. But these aren't the only international factors playing on China's economy. Their continual trade war with the US has also been poisoning their economic growth. This is the fourth reason that China's economy is in trouble. The CCP has been split between two options: giving in to the US to avoid economic ruin, or to assert China's dominance over America. Now, the long-term effects of this are still unclear, but what we do know is that China is suffering because of the trade war. You see, the US has imposed billions in tariffs on Chinese imports, completely damaging the economy's ability to grow. In early 2019, shortly after the trade war began, China's industrial growth fell to only 5%, the lowest in 17 years. Exports and imports both fell in the same year as well, but in an odd twist, the crisis actually played into the Chinese government's hand. The nationalist spirit that came from the trade war was actually used to fuel support for the CCP. It made America look like a more obvious enemy. However, whilst this might have been good short term, the damage that it did to China's economy has only weakened its ability to deal with the next massive problem that it faces. Which leads us on to the fifth reason their economy is in so much trouble, and that's to do with the Chinese housing market. At first, property was the rock on which China's economy was built. The value of property rose pretty much everywhere, and soon trillions of dollars were being invested into the housing market. Today, Chinese banks, who dominate their financial sector, have around 25% of their total investments in property, and this means that the housing market is crucial to China's economy, even more so than in many other countries, which is why the Chinese government has been so worried about it in recent years. Attention was first brought to the fragile market when China's second largest property property developer Evergrande announced that it was in danger of drowning in its over $300 billion worth of debt. And since this announcement last year, things really haven't gotten any better for the property giant. In fact, they've defaulted on numerous debt payments and are now on the brink of insolvency. The death of this company will be felt nationwide, but this isn't just a problem with one Chinese company. Over the past year, we've seen house prices in China fall drastically. In 2021, prices for new homes in China fell by 1.3%, damaging the whole economy in the process. And this is even more shocking when we consider that they were up 5% the year before. These problems have also led to even more bad debt in the economy as well, with nearly 30% of property loans in China now being considered bad loans, with Evergrande and other property developers' debt problems driving this increase. And these might just sound like statistics, but they threaten the very fabric of China's economy, and yet they also portray a deeper issue within the country itself. Just like with their infrastructure projects, China has seen massive amounts of new properties built within the past few decades. The government gave companies like Evergrande large subsidies and incentives to make more and more homes. But in a lot of cases, these projects just went way too far, as Chinese property developers began to offer people mortgages on houses that hadn't even been built yet. The property developers then used this money to fund further housing development plans, rather than using it to finish the one they'd actually been paid for. And this is worrying, considering much of China's population considers investing in housing to be just like putting money in the bank. It just seemed like such a safe investment. But when this vicious cycle continued, as property developers were using more and more money from one project and another to fund the previous ones, and on and on and on. But when something would break the chain, the whole thing would unravel, and people would be left without the home they paid for. And that's why, as of today, there's an estimated 2 million homes in China left unfinished. This is evidenced in the vast concrete cities, left abandoned by their builders halfway through finishing. This process has led many to describe China's housing market as the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time, and has led to massive protests and mortgage boycotts in China, once people started realizing that their house only existed on paper. This grand uprising and the boycotts only reduced the cash flow of property developers like Evergrande, and are a defining factor in their debt problems. And there's no surprise why there's so many boycotts. As I mentioned before, many people in China have invested their savings into property, and this isn't an exaggeration. Over 80% of the population owns property. That's why if the housing market truly crashes, hundreds of millions of people will suddenly lose a huge portion of their life savings. All of these problems would be terrible for a country to deal with, even in a relatively stable, peaceful economic environment. But unfortunately for China, the past year has been anything but that. On top of the mountains of bad debt, the trade war, and the imminent housing crash, China is now facing the largest economic slowdown in its modern history. And it's all due to the sixth and biggest reason why the Chinese economy is in trouble, and that lies in their zero COVID policy. When the pandemic first broke out in China, their response looked like something out of a future dystopia. Their streets were silent, abandoned by everyone except faceless men in hazmat suits. And in the early months, to some it might have seemed like China's tough policies were working. As the rest of the world buckled under COVID lockdowns, China managed to keep the outbreaks relatively contained. But years later, as the rest of the world opened up, China was seemingly closing down again. And this has all been a result of Xi Jinping's dynamic zero COVID policy. President Xi Jinping, looking to secure himself as an unprecedented third term as a de facto dictator, has obviously taken a very hard stance on COVID, which shouldn't be a major shock, considering everything Xi's done to extend state control of normal people's lives. But by taking such a hard zero COVID policy, this has caused widespread long lockdowns across major Chinese cities for months on end. And I can't go fully into this here on YouTube, but to say the least, the experience has been completely miserable for the Chinese people. In lots of cases, they haven't even been allowed to go out to get food. Instead, they're completely at the mercy of deliveries from the CCP, which are notoriously unreliable, with many people actually starving in these grey communist hellhole blocks. And the shutting down of major cities has obviously wreaked havoc on the economy, with China looking set for its worst year in recent history, with major lockdowns across the country pushing this decline. And with Xi's recent announcement that the lockdowns could continue for years to come, it doesn't look like China's COVID problem is going anywhere. But all of this economic chaos and misery may have a good result, not to say that it would justify the cost. The COVID lockdowns especially have set in motion the first impactful protests that China has seen in a very, very long time. It all revolves around an act of bravery from one citizen, similar in nature to the famous tank man of Tiananmen Square. This was seen in early October of 2022, when a lone figure appeared on a bridge in Beijing. He unfurled 2 banners, one of which had this statement written on it: "We want food, not PCR tests. We want freedom, not lockdowns. We want respect, not lies. We want reform, not a cultural revolution. We want a vote, not a leader. We want to be citizens, not slaves." This message struck a nerve with the Chinese populace and quickly went viral, even after Chinese officials dealt with the protester. The censorship machine has been in full swing, with Chinese authorities desperately trying to stop the spread. They even removed a song that had the same name as The Bridge. But of course, this hasn't worked, with Chinese citizens finding ways to outfox the censorship algorithms. One clever way was by not mentioning the protester name by using ambiguous phrases like "I saw it." And protests like these are expected to become commonplace in China if they keep abusing the people they're meant to represent. And as the Chinese economy falters and people begin to suffer, it can only mean more and more instability for the CCP. And the cherry on top of all of this is that the US is now threatening China's economy directly by putting sanctions on the microchips they're so dependent on for their industry. You see, China uses over 75% of the world's microchips, but only makes about 15% of them. And the most advanced microchips, the chips in things like smartphones and computers, are only made in Taiwan. And so by putting sanctions on these microchips and becoming stronger and stronger allies with Taiwan, the US is throttling China's economy together and tighter, with these recent sanctions posing an existential threat to their economy. So of course, with all of these factors, China is getting very desperate, and it seems like there's only one solution: for China to invade Taiwan. By invading Taiwan, the CCP can divert attention from the CCP's failing economy and put it towards propaganda against Taiwan. By going into war, this will reinforce the CCP's strength. If they take over this new country, they will rejuvenate the nationalist spirit within China. They would also protect their economy from US sanctions and restore their national pride. And the pressure is building. If China doesn't do something soon, the public is going to lose all trust in their communist rulers. And with China's recent 20th Party Congress purge and Xi installing a new wartime cabinet, and things aren't looking very good. As it seems like with China's economy crumbling, there can only be one solution for China. And so perhaps this is why Xi sacked the only 3 men with market experience in his cabinet and installed loyalists closely tied with the goal of reunification with Taiwan, markedly changing his cabinet to a wartime one, because Xi and China are now preparing for the next chapter in human history. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more controversial videos that I can't release to the public, consider joining the channel. For just $5.99 a month, you'll have access to monthly exclusive videos not released to the public, where you can watch our videos on Ted Kaczynski and our Mr. Robot series review, and soon we'll be releasing a video on the man behind Gay Frogs. In addition to the exclusive videos, you'll also have access to my private Discord group. All you have to do is click the join button below or click the link in the description.